I came to have an interest in this because I was a professor for a number of years at the Military Academy of Saint-Cyr, the French Sandhurst in France, and made a great friendship with Clément, Chevalier, who is a captain at the War College, the École de Guerre in Paris, and his beautiful and lovely and fascinating wife, Natalie. And Natalie, please say hello to everyone. The power behind the throne. And we realized that there was a very interesting subject in Sweden's Royal Regiment, which served the kings of France throughout the 18th century. And I shall go a bit more into detail. Clement and I decided to write a book on the subject, which will come out shortly, and I think Alexander said there will be an opportunity for everyone, should they so wish, to order books for themselves and their family, their friends and relatives not seen in many years through the website. The book should be available in a few months. The research, basically the details of the battles and the original French archives were explored by Clément, and I did all the Swedish material because I had done my doctorate in Sweden, and I'm an academic at Cambridge University in history, particularly history of the Nordic countries and Russia, and more recently Belarus, Ukraine, and my latest interest is now Turkey and learning Turkish and Ottoman Turkish. But to go back to this, I'm going to be talking to you on the Royal Swedish Regiment. I will give you a general political and cultural, social background, and then afterwards, Clément will go into far more detail about the battles and other matters. Do, at the end, ask any questions. I'm sure we'd be very happy to answer any questions. I'm sure Clément will know lots and lots of answers. I'll do my best, I can't promise. So, let's begin. How did Protestant Sweden end up in the early 17th century having a special relationship with Catholic France, bearing in mind that being a Catholic in Sweden at the time was incurred a capital punishment. So people always talk about the wars of religion, the 30 Years' War, and a lot of people say, how in the world can that be then, that France's greatest ally during the 30 Years' War, Clément, we need your help already. You see? And no surprises why I
I hope it will be the same after, but...
This is what happened throughout the research.
It's like this, magical.
So, to continue, the 30 Years' War, which erupted in 1618 and carried on until 1648, was one of the most significant wars in world history. It was also the war in which a greater percentage of the population of Europe died than in any other war, including the First and Second World Wars. It was a vicious war, and as I've mentioned before, it was generally considered a war of religion. But in many respects, it was far more a dynastic war between, on the one hand, the Habsburgs of Austria, and on the other hand, Catholic France. So, Catholic France needed an ally. And the great ally was, of course, Sweden. And Sweden, during the first half of the 30 Years' War, was ruled by King Gustav Adolf. And Gustav Adolf was an extremely devout Lutheran, very Protestant, but it meant that he was rather like Britain and the United States in the Second World War were prepared to be great allies of the Soviet Union. So he was to be a great ally of France at the time. And here you see a portrait of Gustav Adolf, who fell in the Battle of Lutzen during the 30 Years' War. Well, his counterpart, the main person he worked with in France to defeat the Habsburgs, was Cardinal Richelieu, who was Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs until 1642. So we see already at this time, France and Sweden developed a special relationship. And this was to grow ever more closely. Actually, although the king fell in the Battle of Lutzen, nonetheless, he was the victor in the 30 Years' War. He brought back a wonderful collection of art from the court of the Emperor Rudolf and made Sweden a great power, not for long, but for a certain period of this time until Russia increasingly appeared upon the scene, something with a relevance for today. Well, let's move forward later into the 17th century. And here you see a relatively modern sculpture from the 150th anniversary of the death of King Carl XII, the great warrior king of Sweden, sculpted by Johann Peter Molin in the middle of the 19th century. And this is in Kungsträdgården in Stockholm. And does anyone know who or what he's pointing a finger at to warn the Swedish people of to beware?
Portuguese.
Portuguese, yes, that's a good thing.
Pointing east.
Pointing east, not Portuguese, right.
Pointing west.
Pointing east. Of course, he's pointing to Russia, who is Sweden's great enemy, and even now, Sweden looks with horror upon Russia's revival. It's not surprising that it was under King Charles XII that a renewed, vigorous friendship was recommenced with France. Now, for a brief period, it has to be said, before in the time of Charles XI, Sweden decided not to fight with France, but against France, around 1691, and sided with the Netherlands. And at that time, I'll leave that to Clement to discuss more in detail, the Swedes were defeated, and they were captured as prisoners of war. But as was usual at this time, the officers, at least, were given the opportunity of changing sides, which they did, and that may sound strange to us today, with permission of the King of Sweden. So they went over to the French and then became active in a specially constituted regiment for them. And Louis XIV was at this time the great military conqueror of so much of the Rhineland, and was in battles for so much of his reign with other countries. But generally speaking, he won them. And the Palace of Versailles, the lifestyle which he created for himself and the court in France, was so prestigious that every country in Europe really wanted to emulate him in some way. And he became known, as everyone probably knows, as the Sun King. Well, when that happened, and in the fullness of time, Karl XII became a great friend of France, it was thought, really, Karl XII should be the great North Star King. North Star, obviously the king of this great northern country that had been victorious in the 30 Years' War. And so it was at this time that the Royal Swedish Regiment became firmly established in France, and it carried on until that fateful year, 1793. Now, the initial battles in which the Swedes were first captured took place as part of the 9 Years' War, which went on from 1688 to 1697. It was often called the War of the Grand Alliance or the War of the League of Augsburg. And it was, as I said, a conflict between France and a European coalition which mainly included the Holy Roman Empire led by the Austrian Habsburg monarchy, the Dutch Republic, England, Spain, Savoy, and Portugal. So if you had said Portugal, you wouldn't have been
I said it too early.
completely wrong. It was fought in Europe and the surrounding seas, as well as in North America and in India. And for that reason, it's said it was perhaps, many people have said, the first global war. Okay. Shortly after this war was concluded, France was to be involved in yet another war, the War of the Spanish Succession, which went on from 1701 to 1714, and was a conflict again involving many of the leading European powers, and was triggered by the death in November 1700 of the childless King Charles II of Spain. It established the principle that dynastic rights were secondary to maintaining the balance of power between different countries. Related conflicts included the 1700 to 1721 Great Northern War, Rákosi's War of Independence in Hungary, the Camisards' revolt in southern France, Queen Anne's War in North America, and minor struggles in colonial India. And I want to point out how this type of idea of maintaining a balance of power between the different countries has now started to break down in our own time, as we see. And nothing has yet come up, unfortunately, to replace it. Well, after the resolution of this war, King Louis XV came to power in France, and he reigned from 1715 to 1704. Here you see a painting of him by Jean-Martial Frédot. His reign was still a very enjoyable one for France, at least in the early part, but the financial drain, which began under Louis XIV with his great victories, grew and grew and grew. As he famously said, "Après moi le déluge," after me, the thunderstorm will take place. But throughout this period, the Royal Swedish Regiment served the kings of France with permission of the Swedish king. It wasn't the only regiment of its sort. There was another purely German regiment, which also fought for the kings of France, especially in those German territories which were not great chums of the Habsburgs. A bit later on, in 1756, yet another war broke out, the 7 Years' War. Again considered by some to be either the first or the second global conflict in European history. It was a struggle for global preeminence between Great Britain and France. In Europe, the conflict arose from issues left unresolved by the War of the Austrian Succession, which had been between 1740 and 48, with Prussia seeking greater dominance. Long-standing colonial rivalries pitting Britain against France and Spain in North America and the Caribbean islands were fought on a grand scale with consequential results. In Europe, the war broke out over territorial disputes between Prussia and Austria, which wanted to regain Silesia after it was captured by Prussia in the previous war. Britain, France, and Spain both fought in Europe and overseas with land-based armies. And at sea with naval forces, while Prussia sought territorial expansion in Europe and the consolidation of its power. Unfortunately, in 1774, poor King Louis XV had an amorous affair with a young girl. Had it happened in England today, he would have gone to prison. But unfortunately, for both of them, she had contracted smallpox, and he was to die shortly thereafter of a very nasty form of it. And so his grandson, who you see before you here, King Louis XVI, the last pre-revolutionary King of France, 1754 to 93, the paintings by Antoine François Calais, he assumed the throne, together with his shortly thereafter consort, Queen Marie Antoinette, the Austrian, from 1755 to 93, in this magnificent painting by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. I won't go into the politics of Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. That's the subject of another talk. But during this period, the Royal Swedish Regiment came under the proprietorship of Count Axel von Fersen the Younger, who was a French minister, lived 1755 to 1810, by Carl Friedrich, the painting by Carl Friedrich von Breda, a very famous Swedish artist of the time. Von Fersen, some people have said, had a romantic relationship with the Queen. Other people have said it was platonic. I can't answer for the intimacies of their relationship, but suffice to say he was devoted to the royal family, both the King and the Queen, and to France, with the permission of the Swedish monarch. And he was active in all sorts of military actions. Throughout Europe, he was active in Gibraltar, many parts of the European continent. Sadly, he was to make a very sad end when much later, in fact in 1810, a mob in Stockholm had mistakenly thought the Swedish king at that time had been murdered by von Fersen, and he was torn apart by a rabid mob. And then it was found out the king wasn't even dead at the time. But that didn't much help von Fersen. And later, during his period, King Gustav III, who you see before you here, in this splendid portrait by a Swedish artist, ruled. As you can tell, even in this portrait, he was not of the great military caliber or appearance. He looks a bit more like a ballet dancer, I think you might say, and his personality was indeed more like that of a ballet dancer. But he did wage a lot of wars, not least against Russia, and lost them, which was not very good, and irritated many people. But the king, too, was a great supporter of the French monarchy, of Louis and Marie Antoinette. And so, when the American Revolution broke out, 1775, lasting till 83, he was quite happy for Axel von Fersen and the Royal Swedish Regiment to support Lafayette and others in the American Revolution, something for which they're still honored in America for to this day. And of course, we all know that George Washington and the American Revolution won, and the final defeat of Britain was the siege of Yorktown. And here we see a painting done later, 1791, by Auguste Coudet. Now, the Americans obviously were and are delighted that Swedes, and of course the French predominantly, helped them to win the revolution. But France was creating the seeds of its own destruction in this. Why? People, intellectuals and lawyers in particular, back in France, many of them decided they wanted a bit of the slice of power and to rule France to the disadvantage of the nobility and the monarchy. Also, the expense of helping the Americans during the Revolution, not to mention all the other wars we've just been considering, led to the French Revolution itself. And I don't know if anyone of you have listened to David Starkey, the historian, but as he has pointed out, and as also many others have pointed out back into the 18th century in Britain, and I rather agree with it, also French historians like Philippe de Villiers today, the revolution gave birth to ultimately not only the minor revolutions of the 19th century, but first the Portuguese Revolution in the early 20th, and then the catastrophic Russian Revolution. And we are all still suffering the effects of the French Revolution. These are some of the flags of the Royal Swedish Regiment, which have French fleur-de-lis, but with Swedish colors, gold and blue. And so here, one of the last great acts that he's gone down in history for, Axel von Fersen, was to try to assist the king and queen to escape the revolution, their flight to Varennes on the 20th to the 21st of June, 1791. This is a painting done by an Englishman, Thomas Falcon Marshall, in 1854. And during this occasion, the king, rather foolishly, allowed him to be himself seen near the borders in his true form, thinking that the ordinary soldier would come and rally to him. Unfortunately, one of the soldiers didn't rally to him and made sure that he was apprehended, returned, and as we all know, on the 21st of January, he was put to death by the revolutionaries. If any of you go to France, there is a memorial service in the chapelle expiatoire for the souls of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, and usually the Duc d'Anjou, who is a descendant of both Louis XIV and Generalissimo Franco, funnily enough, is present at that event. Well, the French Revolution succeeded, and Gustav III was horrified. Initially, he allowed a few officers to stay on in France to at least keep a tiny finger of Sweden in the pie, but he realized it wasn't going to work. And so finally, after the assassinations or this murder, legalized murder, he returned all the officers to Sweden. The regiment, as a regiment, carried on, but as a purely French regiment, and lost all its identity in connection with Sweden. The revolution, however, continued, and but I should say also in 29th of March 1792, Gustav III himself was assassinated at a masked ball at the Opera House in Stockholm, not by lawyers or a mob, but by a disaffected aristocrat who felt that Gustav III's pretensions to absolute power had too far diminished the power of the nobility. Meanwhile, back in France, the revolution grew more and more vicious, and what you see here is a famous painting of the shootings at Nantes in the west of France in 1793 during the Wars of the Vendée, in which the so-called 12 infernal columns, commanded by General Louis-Marie Turreau, were ordered to kill all the Vendéens they encountered, men, women, and children. And this is the final painting I'm showing you today. It's the drownings at Nantes that same year, which led to the death of almost 4,000 people by order of the Republican General Jean-Baptiste Carrier. Some people have said these mass murders in the Vendée were the first commissions of European genocide. And the Republicans piled up to 4,000 people into men, women, and children, into boats, into the middle of the Loire River, and sank them. Altogether, almost 400,000 people were mass murdered in the Vendée, which is something to remember when one goes to France on Bastille Day and hears everyone talking about the glories of the French Revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. And now I shall move out of the way and let Clément carry on.
Many thanks, Neil, for this superb presentation. I will try to be like you, I hope. So I prepare effort to stay stand up to explain, because I think it's best better for a military man to walk a bit in front of you and to show you some pictures, I say. So, it's two officers from the Royal Swedish Regiment in 1782, a bit before the French Revolution. First of all, I would like to thank you, everybody, to be there to hear this. I particularly thank Andreas Nielsen and the Anglo-Swedish Society who made this conference possible. I thank you, my wife, my lovely wife. She did a wonderful and long walk to support me. No, to walk with me. too. I must say that is a real honor for a French officer to be able to come and talk to you about a subject that touches on the military history of Europe, and that highlights the age-old traditions of friendship that have always united Sweden and France. The Royal Swedish Regiment has left a famous and glorious name in our history. It's no coincidence that this conference is taking place in beautiful England, the crucible of Western history and the proud representative of a centuries-old monarchy. I would also like to pay tribute to Viscount Robert Grovel, man of letters and military historian specializing in the French troop of the Ancien Régime and the army of the immigrants. It's thanks to a number of his writings archived in the beautiful library of the Château de Chantilly, with a whipped cream. It comes from this, so I remember this. Château de Chantilly, and particularly his research on the Royal Swedish Regiment, that we have been able to form an idea of the framework that was our own research. I show you some picture about the castle because I think it's important to see. It's near Paris. I think you know, or you have seen this once. And the library is here, exactly. I worked in this place during so many months to have a good research. Yeah. Indeed, Viscount Grovel, through passion and tradition, was very active in Franco-Swedish relations. Continuing the exchanges between French and Swedish aristocrats in the 18th century, we are following in his footsteps by bringing this subject up to date and with, I hope, elements that were still unknown until this day. The century of the Royal Swedish Regiment was a time of iron and fire, but also a time of diplomacy pushed to its limits. The testimonies of Swedish, English, and French officers speak for themselves. They all speak of respect and grandeur before talking about war, as if the time of night was not yet over. It's a battle of Fontenoy in 1745, when the French officer was in front of the English officer to speak with him before the battle. He proposed to the English officer to fire at first. And no, the English officer proposed to the French officer to fire at first, but the French officer says, no, you fire at first. It was the rule of the war at the time. It was a duel, like a duel. But the battle was very violent after, so it's another history story. For the common man, hatreds are tenacious, but for the brave man, only the image of righteousness and courage counts, which are universal feelings that transcend time. I hope it's the same now. I'm sure it's the same now. As Neil has explained very well before me, The diplomatic relations between Sweden and France during the 18th century allowed for the creation of a strong link between these two countries. The fruit of this alliance is the creation of the Royal Swedish Regiment, of which I will speak briefly. I try. Focusing on military operations, I will say little or nothing about the chronology, which is, I hope, well presented in the book. First of all, war in the 18th century was the work of the prince. That is to say, it was a continuation of politics by other means. It generally said that Louis XIV was too fond of war. But this is to say too little about the geopolitical situation in France at that time. Indeed, the Kingdom of France was subject to repeated invasion from the northeast of its territory. For various reasons. It was a corridor through which all the European army passed and was therefore a place of great danger for France. Louis XIV wanted above all to create what could be called the précaré, which is France as it appears today, more or less, in order to protect himself against these invasions. To illustrate its importance, the victory of Marshal de Villars at Denain in 1712 literally saved France for a general invasion. It was almost in the place here. It will correspond today for France to the victory at the Marne in 1914. During the 30 Years' War, the armies were largely made up of mercenaries, commanded by warlords or adventurers, noble or not, who had the financial capacity to buy their regiment. For a regiment is, above all, a business that is maintained and made to grow with its particular clientele and successive purchases. Being in the pay of the King of France meant being reimbursed financially for certain expenses and obtaining favors. The question is to know who is in charge. Among the troops, the actual commander is the lieutenant colonel, often coming from a lower rank and knowing his work perfectly. The colonel is the owner, but above all, they must maintain his business with a great figure of the court. Thus, in 1783, Axel von Fersen made numerous trips back and forth between Versailles and his garrison, for the love of Marie Antoinette, of course, but for his regiment too. It helps him, I think. Louis XV tried with varying degrees of success to continue this policy, which only really came to an end with the 7 Years' War. Louis XVI carried out reforms to modernize the navy and tried to counter English influence by fighting in the America alongside the insurgents. If we take the situation between the middle and the end of the 17th century, we can therefore say that it was Sweden that preceded France in its mastery of the art of war, since Gustav Adolphus, known as the Great or the Lion of the North, was and still remains one of the best tacticians in Europe, approaching the reputation of Frederick of Prussia and Napoleon. The relative peace that fell upon a nation that had become warlike by character as well as by necessity forced its leaders, the officers, to emigrate to France, to find something to sharpen their weapons. We have seen that there were a godsend for the French army, and that many of them served in France for a century and died on the battlefield. From the end of the 17th century onwards, foreign officers went to France to train in the profession of arms and to wage war. Because, as we have seen, where there was sometimes peace, the nobility no longer had the opportunity to perfect their military skill. This was the case in Sweden, which had won the 30 Years' War but was relatively peaceful at the end of the century. Military operations were carried out at a fast pace, and this allowed European armies to modernize. In the 18th century, the century of enlightenment was not only the century of encyclopedists and philosophers, but also that of the military. There were countless treatises and other writing on tactics, claiming to solve the insoluble problem of the order of a regiment on the battlefield. From column or line, how should the troops behave under fire? What was the best way to fight in order to win the battle? Since the 1650s, the army has become permanent. That is to say, it no longer has recourse to mercenaries. The army consists of approximately 100,000 men in peacetime and 400,000 men in wartime. It was the regiment itself that took care of the recruitment of its men, thanks to the recruiting sergeants. They dressed sumptuously to attract men, recruiting whoever and whatever they could to increase the numbers, with trickery being common. For example, young men were drunk in cabarets and then enlisted. The posters are explicit. No notice to the fair youths. By order of the king, young men of good looks who wish, with pleasure, to serve the king, can address themselves in all confidence to the sergeant who will satisfy their will. Of course, after a night to drink, it was easy to enter in the regiment. Yeah. Soldiers sign up for 4, 6, or 8 years. Most of them are illiterate, but sometimes their officer take care of them and give them lessons. Finding themselves quickly away from their homes, the company and the regiment became their only family. However, they were well dressed. Exercises and drills are frequent. Head and body movements, tight order, endless and complicated handling of weapons. For example, the rifle is loaded in 12 steps. It's long to fight during a battle. It's said that it takes 6 years to make a real soldier at this time. No, it's not the same, it's shorter, I hope, because it's 6, it's a bit long. The armies are grouped in camps. The Minister of War, Louvois, sends the unit leaders' routes to follow to get there. He specifies the route to be followed and the location of each stage. At each stage, an étapier who had concluded a contract with the royal administration provided the troops with accommodation and food. The soldiers were housed with the inhabitants. The infantry can travel between 9 and 12 miles per day and have 1 day off every 4 days. Cavalry can travel between 15 and 18 miles per day and have 1 day off every 5 days. The army must concentrate on one point in 3 weeks. Food and artillery are ordered to reach this point on a specific date. Now, I don't know, it's longer, but I think it's maybe the same. 3 weeks. It's a good period, I think. Yeah. Now, I would like to speak about general tactics. The first way of waging war in this time is sieges. Since troops depended on the places where food and and ammunition were concentrated, warfare under Louis XIV was essentially a war of sieges. The capture of a city determined the success or failure of a military campaign. We will take the example of Marshal de Villars, who repelled the Allied invasion at Denain in 1712. He understood that if he took the town by surprise, he would deprive the enemy of his only possibility of a resupply. What is known as the Battle of Denain is in fact the capture of the town's redoubts, then of the town itself. Siege warfare was therefore unavoidable because it was the first way of waging war during the reign of Louis XIV and the beginning of the reign of Louis XV. The capture of a city was a prerequisite for the success of a military campaign, so sieges could last 4 months. An army cannot go to war in another country if it does not secure its supply lines. Supply lines are fortified cities or strong points. If the supply line is broken, the armies withdraw, the war is over, it's finished. Let's imagine our regiment in 1697 in front of the city of Barcelona during the War of the League of Augsburg. The troops encircled the fortified suburb of the city. 7,000 peasants were requisitioned to help the soldiers dig trench lines and build fortifications around the city. Circumvallation lines were set up behind the besiegers so as not to be attacked from behind, and countervallation lines of fortification, trenches, barriers, etc., were set up around the city to cut off the city's supplies. Soldiers dig trenches in order to get close to the city walls. Once the trenches are completed and the approach is successful, the attack is concentrated on one gate of the city where artillery fire is carried out for about 30 hours. The city surrenders either after an assault or after its surrender. Second way of waging war is pitched battles. Let's imagine the Royal Swedish Regiment at the beginning of the Battle of Lafayette in 1747. Joseph Magnus Paré is in command. The regiment arrives on the battlefield in columns and turns around to form a line facing the enemy. This movement is slow because all the troops must be well aligned and the officers have to go over it several times. Behind the rows of men are the sergeants. Their role is clear. They squeeze the people so that they are lined up. In French, sergeant is a sergent pour serrer les gens. Squeeze the people. Serrer le sergeant. The regiment takes its place in 2 lines of 3 rows. The artillery takes place in front of the infantry line. It's not mobile. The French cavalry set up on the wings with the aim of taking on the enemy's artillery and overrunning the enemy from the flanks. This is the linear tactic or scene order, defended by some senior officers. When the battle begins, both artilleries fire as much as they can each other. The result is sometimes less on the enemy rows, but the battlefield is covered with a huge cloud of black powder. It's impossible to see and to see your army. The eyes and throats turn, and one could only hear the orders given by the leaders. After a while, the regiment and all the infantry lines advance to the center and fire at each other. The two lines allow the fire to roll so that it does not stop. At this point, the violence of the fire causes by the less experienced to withdraw in their disorder, and it's not uncommon to see entire lines break contact. I assure you it's not the case for the Royal Swedish Regiment. The lines did not charge because there was doubt about their shock power. The cavalry charged from the wings in an attempt to take out the enemy's artillery. For example, this was the tactic used by the armies at the Battle of Rocroi in 1643. It's said that the cavalry is the queen of battles because it's the cavalry that decides the fate of a day. At this precise moment, we are in the middle of the quarrel of tactics, which is carried out during the whole of the 18th century. It opposes the partisans of the thin order, the line of battle, and the deep order, the column of battle. As we have just seen, the line allows fire but less so the charge because it extends too far over the battlefield. It's a Prussian army. She was the master of a line. It's a perfect line. The column does not allow for firing but charging en bloc, as the Anglo-Dutch troops did during the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. The lines and the column here. But at the end, the French won, but it's an attempt was made to find a compromise between these two tactics. Swedish officers living in France produced numerous tactical writings. They had been the repositories of a high level of military culture since the time of Gustavus Adolphus, and he was as we have seen, they did not want to be outdone. I must admit that with the development of the war, the problem of tactics has still not been solved. At the École de Guerre in Paris, students are greeted by a pediment bearing the words of Marshal Foch, incidentally, the only one who spoke English well among the other generals. He said, "The reality of the battlefield is that one does not study. You simply do what you can to apply what you know. Therefore, to be able to do a little, you have to know a lot and well." This is how our regiment fought, alternating phases of siege with phases of pitched battles. The Swedish officers of the regiment worked as they had for a century, honoring the alliance that had been made at the end of the 17th century. One event particularly symbolizes the service that Sweden rendered to France. It was the protection that King Louis XV gave to the regiment by elevating it to the title of Royal, in order to show his satisfaction with the brilliant value that it had shown in the wars. The regiment thus took the name Royal Suédois and remained loyal to the French monarchy to the end. If Axel von Fersen's plan had worked, he would have escorted the king and his family to Germany, but history decided otherwise. To conclude, I will quote Viscount Robert Gruvell. "War has no excuse or interest unless it's waged by daring adventure seekers who want to escape from normal life. Today, as in the past, this adventure seeker is a professional soldier. He's a mysterious, complicated, sentimental man, dominated by his imagination and secret ideal. He obeys laws that he himself does not know, having his morals made for a small number of friends and comrades. This soldier fights, not for the pleasure of fighting, but for the pleasure of feeling like being apart from the other. The freedom of the great outdoors has no reward. It's life for life's sake, confidence in one's own strength, and the endless road ahead, without any goal, lined with daily milestones and leading to self-abandonment. The imaginary life of a professional soldier is so rich that it includes satisfaction of a lofty melancholy that rehabilitates some and elevates those who have no reason to be rehabilitated. On my part, I believe that soldier today is a legionnaire, the infantryman and the cavalryman, Swedish, English, or French. But it's also the Royal Swedish Grenadier in his blue and yellow uniform, marching on the roads of Europe under the folds of the flag, where the friendly color of Sweden and France are mixed, a living symbol of honor and fidelity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both. We have time for a few questions. Who's going to be brave? Lots of brave people. William.
Like tirer le premier fusil, perhaps. I like you, I'm a soldier, or was a soldier. And the fascination for me about these paintings is that they don't reflect the reality of battle in the 18th century, because the powder that they had then was so impenetrable that actually you couldn't see anything at all. So all of these beautiful things, is that your understanding too?
Oh yeah, of course, it's exactly that, and I think the smell too, the smell of blood and everything, it's human waste and everything. It was horrible, it's beautiful to see this on the painter, of course, but when we read some testimonies, it's always like a very horrible moment. But at this same moment, we have some officers to fight with nobility and everything. So it's an image of something, of course, but it happens, for example, during the Battle of Fontenoy. It was a very strong day with a lot of wounded soldiers, but it happens this, but the battlefield was an horrible place. Was it was horrible. Of course, it's a war. Yeah.
David?
Yeah, I just want to ask you, in terms of the people in the regiment, am I right in thinking that the ordinary soldier, of whom you spoke so eloquently in terms of their bravery, was not himself a Swede? But it was more that the officers, the colonels and above, were Swedes who were, as it were, marshalling the troops to be part of the battle. Is that correct?
Yeah. The first language was German during the battle. And I think, because the regiment was created with German prisoners. I think during the battle, the order were very in German, or maybe in French, but in Sweden, in Swedish, I don't know if it happens like this. Maybe between the officer or. But
I was going to say, in the 30 Years' War, for example, when Sweden was victorious, most of the soldiers fighting for Gustavus Adolphus were English or Scottish mercenaries
Mercenaries.
who had enlisted.
Yeah.
And you had many cases with Russia
Yeah.
that Swedes or Dutchmen would turn and fight with Russia and then change again and fight with Sweden or Holland. There wasn't this nationalistic sense
No.
that we had from the time of Napoleon onwards.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
I noticed you said about the siege, the way things were done in the siege. Actually, sieges still go on, but they're not done as taking a town, they're done with disruption. China just tried to move its entire army in an exercise, I think a year or so ago, and even using public transport, they couldn't actually get the whole army to the battlefield.
Yeah.
They just couldn't get that many people moved. So this is why you've got this thing now with America, Russia. They've realised that China's got the biggest, most horrible army in the world, but it's stuck in China mainly. So the siege is still actually a major part, isn't it?
Yeah.
Neil, if you want to stand up to also address the questions. No, both together, yes. Who wants to pipe up next? Andreas?
The previous painting you had before of the battlefield, and really you can see the chaos that really must have been experienced during in the midst of it. It brought to mind a quote. I can't remember who said it. It was a German military general or military man who said that any battle plan does not survive exposure to the enemy.
Exactly.
Thank you. And I believe that probably still holds true for the modern soldier. What do you say, Clement?
It's true, it's really true. After 1 hour it's finished, the plan that doesn't exist. You have to adapt everything, and I think the real spirit of the war is to adapt very well to the event. But it's an art, it's why there is an art. It's true, exactly.
In the back, very, very clear.
For Neil, how did the Royal Swedish Regiment react to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes?
Well, the Edict of Nantes really took place before it was irrelevant. It had no implications at all, because it remains, France was, in theory, Louis XIV, under the influence of his morganatic wife, former mistress, became very, very Catholic and wanted France truly to be a Catholic country, and Louis XIV became very pious. At the same time, Sweden, it remained throughout the entire period up until the 1850s, I think 1856, a capital crime to become or practice Roman Catholicism in Sweden unless you were a member of a foreign embassy. And if you were a noble, you lost all of your possessions as well. So although in theory Sweden was deeply Protestant and France was deeply Catholic, when it came to this type of military collaboration, it meant absolutely nothing. And also it should be said that most of the officers of the Swedish regiment, because they were second generation connections to the regiment, often had French Catholic mothers. So effectively in France, by the end of the period, a lot of these officers were in fact practicing Roman Catholics and never really spent much time in Sweden.
We have another question, yes?
Yeah, thanks Neil, Clement. This was absolutely fascinating. I just wanted to sort of ask, is there any indication that the Swedish regiment made any difference to French military success or otherwise?
Oh yeah. It's a really good question. For example, during 2 or 3 bad battles, the Royal Swedish Regiment was braver than the other. For example, it's the Battle of Malplaquet, It was a very terrible battle, and the Royal Swedish Regiment was in the right line. And he supported the main attack of the Allied infantry. So yeah, and during the siege of Prague, the regiment won his title of Royal Swedish Regiment. It's thanks to this siege. It was not a victory, but it was a good fight. Yeah. For example, in the book, we write about more bad battle and everything. Yeah, of course. But Malplaquet is a very horrible bad battle, and the siege of Prague.
I think you'd like to say that Malplaquet was the biggest death in a battle in Europe.
Exactly.
That we've seen, a bit like Bloody Towton in England.
Yeah, exactly.
That wasn't a swear word, by the way.
I should add that another element in the battle was the whoever the commander was, and if he was in the field and immensely well loved, he could create an esprit de corps, which really drove the men to be much more productive as far as winning the battle than if he was someone that they didn't approve of or like, which occasionally happened.
Charles XII would be a great example, of that, because he was somebody the troops really admired and almost worshipped.
Even now, I've been in Sweden in homes of officers, and they will proudly have over their chimney piece a portrait in oil of, as they say, Karl den Tolfte, Charles XII.
Much loved until he was shot in the back of the head by one of his own men. Is that an interesting discussion? A possibility.
It's not confirmed. It was a very foggy day. We didn't see where it came from.
Exactly.
Do we have any more questions before we go back to mingling and... Any more brave souls out there before we do our thank yous?
Well, let me make a little advert for the future. Clément and I have just started a new book under contract, which is a history of the intelligence apparatus of the Stuarts in exile in France, Saint-Germain-en-Laye. And a little known fact, maybe the subject of another future talk, is that the decryptions of, in espionage of the Stuarts was carried out in Swedish.
Yes, please. I'll find it.
In that case, behind. Kidneys. I'm going to say thank you so much, both. It was amazing. We've learned a lot, and what a nice way to come back together again after 25 months of Zooming. In glorious plastic, we'd like to...
Not really a tie, but complimentary. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, of course. Thank you. You know, thank you. It's a real honor to be with you and everything. Yeah, thank you very much.
We're very happy to have you as part of our... a little bubbly because you see, you're already a member, a council member.
And I have a proud owner of the Swedish tie as well. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Because it's the first time we've met for a long time. So really, I'd like to give one to David.
No, sure.
Yes, who got us doing the zooming and kept us together. And to Antoinette, who's a very supportive council member, and also seriously. Well, yes, you did. Because not only are you our first ever scholar, but became a council member. But you've also brought lots of, not just joy and happiness, no, but also events and much activity. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here.